Hi, everybody. This is Joanne with Read Science, and I'm here today with my co-host, Jeff Schomeyer. And we are joined by our guest, Lee Dugatkin, who is a prolific author, actually, a biologist and an author. And today we're going to talk specifically about the book he co-authored with Ludmila Trut, How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, Visionary Scientists and a Siberian Tale of Jump-Started Evolution. And welcome, Lee. We're so glad you could be here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this endlessly. So we're in good time.
We're good. This is great. So you are at the University of Louisville, and you are interested in evolution of social behavior and the history of science. So this is a perfect book for you to write, it seems.
Right. It certainly merges my loves. I mean, for a long time, I was, an evolutionary biologist doing experiments and developing mathematical models. But I've really fallen in love with the history of science issues. And so this brings it all together for me in a way that was just unique.
So I see in your bio, you're an author of over 150 articles on evolution and behavior in some lovely journals, such Proceedings of National Academy of Science, Nature, and of course you have written some articles for Washington Post, Scientific American, other places that our wonderful guests tend to write at. And so you've written a few textbooks. And fun fact, for those of you who don't know, your evolution book, it turns out I was the narrator for your animations, which you didn't know because the publisher takes care of that. But they chose me because I could pronounce scientific terminology. So I should put a shingle out, narrator, right? Biology.
Yeah, no. And you did a great job too. Yeah, and that book was really wonderful to work on as well. Much more technical than what we're going to talk about today, but you know.
And you've written other popular science books as well.
Yes, I've written on natural history, on Thomas Jefferson in natural history, and I've written on some fascinating characters involved in the evolution of altruism and cooperation, and then this one is the latest one.
Great.
We're going to talk about an experiment that you describe in your book that has been going on for decades, and it's interesting that the book is about that experiment, and it's fascinating. And I should reveal up front that I'm predisposed to enjoy the story, I think, because we live with greyhounds at my house. And,
yes.
I'm a dedicated dog person, so I'm happy to hear about this. But to get us started on the story, which may be in the back of some people's minds, I think I'd like to go way back and talk about Dmitry Belyaev and what he was doing and how he got into this business of raising foxes, where he got the money, and particularly, for the starters, what Soviet science and Soviet genetic science was like in the 50s when he was setting out to do this, because that colored so much of how he got started. And then
absolutely. Yes. So Belyaev is a remarkable individual. The short version of how this got going was that this was a fellow who, in the late 1930s, was a student at an agricultural academy, and so he was studying genetics there, and he also had a lot of exposure to domesticated animals at an agricultural academy, right? And so, after he finishes there, he, like most Soviet males at the time, spent 4 years in World War II. And when he came back, he landed a job as a scientist at a place in Moscow that focused on fur breeding animals. Okay. And the main ones there were foxes and minks, because there was, at this time in the mid 40s, fox and mink were really two of the rare commodities that brought Western money into the Soviet Union, and they desperately needed this. Okay, so he's there, and it's at this place that he begins thinking about the ideas that will eventually translate into the 60-year-long experiment. And it's fascinating to sort of see how it all started, which was basically that Belyaev and others recognized that many domesticated species share a whole bunch of similar characteristics. So they have things like floppy ears and curly tails, and they have low stress hormone levels, and they have mottled, funky coloration, and a whole bunch of other things that today, this is the domestication syndrome. It's so common across animals. Okay, so but Belyaev at this time in the mid 40s, late 40s was asking himself, you know, why is this? This is such an odd thing. I mean, we domesticated animals for like a whole suite of different reasons. Some of them we domesticated for transportation, right? Horses. Some of them we domesticated for food. Some of them we domesticated for companionship and protection. But nonetheless, they all tend to share these many characteristics. And why? So Belyaev's insight and what really drove the experiment from day one was this. He hypothesized that the one thing that our ancestors always needed when we domesticated animals was we needed animals that didn't bite our heads off. Right? And so Belyaev hypothesized that all major domestication events involving animals in our history, at the start, our ancestors were selecting animals that were calm, tame, pro-social towards humans. Right? And he further hypothesized that all these other traits that we associate with domesticated animals, floppy ears and curly tails and so on, all of those somehow or another came along for the ride, that they were somehow genetically connected. He didn't have any idea how, but that was his hypothesis. And then he decided that when he had the opportunity, he would actually put these ideas to the test. And he got that opportunity in the 1950s. Initially, he did a little pilot experiment, and then in the late 1950s, he got a chance to do a full-blown experiment where he would test these ideas and domesticate foxes in real time and watch what happened. In terms of the scientific environment that you referred to, this was a very dangerous time to be doing what Belyaev wanted to be doing, because his idea was really that what they would do is they would select the calmest, tamest foxes every generation, and they would breed them. And they would do this year after year after year. Now, any experiment like that is an experiment in genetics, but it was against the law to do Western Mendelian genetics at that time in the Soviet Union. And the reason was a fellow by the name of Trofim Lysenko. And yes, right, thumbs down to Lysenko. This is a guy who single-handedly set Soviet science back 30 years. Basically, he was a charlatan, a pseudoscientist, but what he argued, he said that at the time, so now we're again at this point by the mid to late 1950s, Lysenko is saying that modern genetics was bourgeois lies that was being promulgated by Western wreckers and saboteurs. And he argued that a long disproven idea that's known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. By this time, there was tons of evidence that this was incorrect. But Lysenko said not only was it correct, and then he made up data from things he was doing with plant domestication to make it seem like it worked. But he also said that it was more in line with the Soviet philosophy. And as a result of this, he rose up not only in the scientific establishment, but more importantly in the political establishment, so much so that there's this wonderful photo where after he gives one of these speeches calling Western geneticists saboteurs and wreckers, Stalin stands up and yells out, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko." And what happened because of all this was that thousands of Soviet geneticists lost their jobs. Hundreds were thrown into prison, and a few dozen, including Belyaev's much older brother, were murdered by Lysenko's thugs for doing genetics. So this is the environment in which they're about to start this experiment.
There are a lot of fortuitous events here too. The fact that he ends up in a fox breeding program.
That's right.
That turns out to be useful. These foxes have several characteristics that might turn out to be useful, but we learn later, I guess. But I think they knew at the time that foxes are closely related to dogs. So maybe he thinks this might be a good test bed, that he's doing this work. There's Lysenkoism over every shoulder, but he can say, oh, look, I'm breeding foxes to improve their coats and to get them to breed more frequently. He gets the perfect cover for running a breeding program that he can start out, because you've got to get started on this before you're 80 years old. And he can observe what's going on at the same time that he has this cover. It's an amazing thing coming together. Plus, having the ideas that maybe we should just set out selecting these dogs for the ones who these foxes, sorry, for the ones who seem more predisposed not to bite humans. That's a great thing. And so he did this at this little place. He had incredibly resources at first, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I lost.
Just that he started out kind of small because he was working over here in this one place and had limited resources at first, and then the story blossoms.
That's right. So when he first, he sort of tinkers with these ideas in the late 40s, but in the early 50s is when he starts a tiny little pilot experiment. There are hundreds of these farms around the Soviet Union where they're breeding foxes for their fur. He knows a lot of the breeders. He knows somebody in Estonia. They start a tiny little experiment, a couple of dozen foxes every year, choosing the calmest, tamest ones. But you're right. At the start, he had this full-time job in Moscow, and he didn't have the money to do a full-blown experiment. But that all changes in the late 1950s when he gets this new, much more important job over in Siberia.
And might as well. How did that come about? This city of science is sort of like an amazing thing that he's handled.
It's a remarkable place. It's a remarkable place. It's called Akadem Gordak, or the Academic Village. It still exists today. I've been there a number of times. It's really an oasis, a scientific oasis. So basically what happened was, in the late 1950s, Khrushchev and a number of leading Russian scientists got together and they decided that they would build a giant scientific city in Siberia. And they built it outside of the biggest city in Siberia at the time, known as Novosibirsk. And so it's about 45 minutes away from Novosibirsk. So they basically cleared out this large chunk of forest, and they built what eventually became 24 world-class institutes in science, where they literally brought in tens of thousands of people, one way or another, involved with science. And the science included everything from biology, that was the group that Belayev was in, to physics, chemistry, early computer science, mathematics, almost everything. Belayev got a job there as vice director of this new institute that handled biology in 1958. He got the job, and that was what opened up the door for the start of the full-blown fox domestication experiment, because he had now the money and the power to start this in a real way, not just a pilot way. And that's when he went on the hunt for a brilliant young scientist who could take the lead on the experiment.
Right. Yeah. Well, every time I think of this, everything in Siberia, I thought, wow, scientists are really passionate, because we'll go move to Siberia to do our work.
I mean, going to Siberia required tremendous dedication. I will say, when I've been there, I've been there in the winter. It's really quite a beautiful place. I mean, it is a touch cold, but it's really a stunningly beautiful place in the winter. But nonetheless, it required a tremendous amount of courage for people to basically pick up and move to Siberia to do science. But like I say, tens of thousands of people did it for all these institutes, and including Belayev.
And he had the Institute of Cytology and Genetics.
That's right. It was called the Institute of Cytology and Genetics, which is a little odd because it was still quite dangerous to do genetics in the Soviet Union.
I wondered about that. Like, how is, and I kept going, maybe I have the dates wrong in my head.
No.
But
No. I asked. So when I was there, I interviewed dozens of people, and I asked, so, it was still illegal to do genetics. Why did they call it the Institute of Cytology and Genetics? They joke around, saying I would never have spent the time to go past the first 3 words to get to genetics. But but more seriously, what they were saying was, that this was far enough away from the hand of Lysenko that it was relatively not as dangerous as, say, doing this work in Moscow. And so they called it the Institute of Cytology and Genetics. And Belayev got a position there as the vice director in the late 50s.
It was Siberia, so it was, you could call it genetics, apparently.
That's right, yeah.
So, and then up to, let's see, 1958 is where Ludmilla first met with Belayev. And that was an interesting story. And then we'll back a little bit to the first results. But tell us about Ludmilla meeting with Belayev. That was touching.
Sure. So this was in 1958, and Belayev, he's about to move from Moscow, where he's doing this work initially, and then he's going to move to Siberia. And so he needs a young scientist who can be the person who leads this experiment. So what he does is he goes over to Moscow State University, which is an absolutely gorgeous university, but it's also a phenomenally good university. He talks to a colleague of his there, who's an animal behaviorist, and he says, here's what I want to do. I'm going to select these foxes for tameness and calmness. I'm going to see if I can domesticate them. I'm going to see if all these other traits come along. I need somebody young to lead it. So at this time, the fellow puts out the word at Moscow State University, and Ludmilla is finishing up her undergraduate degree at the time. She's 25 years old, and she hears about this. So she comes in and she talks with Belayev. And, you know, when I talk to her about this today, it's really stunning. I mean, our eyes light up. She remembers meeting Belayev for the first time like it happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. And for lots of reasons. So one of which is sort of interesting sociologically is that Belayev now, got this position, he's going to be vice director. He's fairly well known already in the late 1950s. But from the minute Ludmilla walked in, he treated her as an equal. And that was not something that happened in a patriarchal Soviet science system. But he did that immediately, and that really struck her. Then he tells her what he wants to do: select the calmest foxes every year, keep breeding them. She's intrigued. She thinks it's a brilliant idea. She loves the idea, actually, of moving to this new scientific city. Belayev stops for a second. He warns her, look, you know, we're in Siberia. We're kind of away from Lysenko. But if he decided to make an example of us, he could still throw us in prison. Now, everybody knew that. Ludmilla knew that. But it was important to her that Belayev stopped to give her that bit of advice. The other thing that really struck her was that Belayev said, you know, I've done this little pilot experiment in Estonia. It went okay. I think this is a really fascinating idea, but, you know, keep in mind, this is a domestication experiment. This could take a long time before anything interesting happens. He tells her it could take 10 years, it could take 20 years, it could take your whole life. Ludmilla, though, was hooked. She loved the idea. He offered her the position, and then she and her husband and their 2-year-old daughter took a train from Moscow to Siberia, and they began the great experiment.
Right. And, well, we've got the picture, and we could talk about that, but I don't know. They're going to breed these foxes. They select the tamest ones. They breed those, and they watch for things to happen. And it was only by page 50 where I'm already getting excited. And you say that by generation 4 at what they call the farm, a little fox pup named Ember was wagging his tail. And right. This is a great breakthrough almost, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, it was sort of this incredibly dog-like thing. For foxes don't do this. It was an incredibly dog-like thing. And it was one of the first events that, you know, just were kind of magical to them in terms of, whoa, you know, this could happen, and it could happen faster than we thought. And it was actually only a matter of a few more years before not only were the foxes that they were choosing for the experiment, not only were they wagging their tails, but they were starting to wag their curly tails. And that was one of the first of those classic domestication traits that appear in so many domesticated animals. And now it was in domesticated foxes. And I think that sometimes people forget that never, ever, ever do they select foxes to breed for the next generation based on whether their tails are curly or, you know, so it's always based on behavior. And yet, lo and behold, these other things are starting to emerge even after just 5, 6, 7 years into the experiment.
And, you know, actually, when I was reading the book, I was struck, first of all, at your ability to convey all this, but how precise and detailed Ludmilla was in I mean, marking down everything, her observation skills, her ability to record all of this. And I thought, man, that's overwhelming. And that's before computers, and she could just put it all in a nice, program to sort of keep track.
Yes,
right?
I mean, she's an astonishing scientist and an astonishing person. And even early on, she was doing what you said. So initially, for the first 5 years of the experiment, it had to be done a little bit away from where the institute was, because only after about 6 or 7 years did they have a place there that they could work. Mm-hmm. So initially, she had to go far away. And I mean, her daily routine was just incredible. I mean, she would get up by herself. She had some helpers occasionally, but essentially she would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and she would start testing dozens and dozens of foxes on how calm and tame they were around her. And then she would go back to this little room at where she stayed at nights, and she would then record all of the information in a much more precise, she'd be taking notes as she was there, and then she would record it onto more precise data sheets, and she'd be up until 11 at night after starting at 6 o'clock in the morning, and she would do this day after day after day after day. And at the same time, it wasn't just that she was recording things, she was actually talking, she was in contact with Belayev and coming up with new ideas, new twists to the experiment, new things they can look for early, even from the start.
It's probably, to underscore what Joanne said, we should emphasize at this point that she's not looking to say, what a bunch of cute pups, let's breed these cute ones over here, but that she and Belayev had talked about this and had, as one should, pre-established criteria, what we might even call rubrics today, that said, here is how we will judge, which means measure by looking for thresholds and things, which pups are the tamest that will go to the next level, right? And those are pretty strict.
They were. And they're, they've certainly been modified over the years, but in essence, they're using very similar things where they're, like you say, they a priori have certain things that they're going to record at different stages of their interaction with the animals, so that they don't let observer bias creep in, so that they don't let, other things besides the behavioral tameness affect who gets chosen. Because like you say, it's kind of, I mean, you have to fight yourself. Some of these pups, they're incredible. They may be incredibly cute. Maybe they're not tame, but so you're tempted to say, oh, maybe they'll be the ones we breed for the next generation. But of course, that never happened, because they're fanatics about this, the way they should be in terms of the strict criteria that they use to select the pups.
But as a model of science in action and how science works, which is an important story that you tell here that people can easily overlook, because they project a lot and think that Ludmilla's just choosing the cute ones or something. But yes, you can change your criteria for what constitutes tameness. Things get refined as you go, but you must establish your selection before you see the pups.
That's right. And most of the things that we would say, use the word cuteness for, those are things that came about because of the selection for tameness. It wasn't, as you're saying here, you're right, it's not the criteria for how you get chosen, but it is something that happened as a result of their program.
And so
That's
you're
right,
just
because the actual features eventually became manifest. The things that we think of as adorable, like larger eyes and these.
I noted these as I was reading, and you have that in 1965, with the 6th generation of pups, and this is only the 6th generation at the farm now in the
that's right,
in Siberia. There was hand licking, belly rubs being asked for, and an apparent strong desire to be with humans.
Right, including whining when humans leave them.
But these were not, emphasize again, these were not the selection criteria.
Well, things like how the whining, for example, and the hand licking, those would have been considered pro-social human traits. Those would have been okay to use as the criteria. But the curly ears and the soon-to-be curly tails and the soon-to-be floppy ears, those were not criteria.
Yes. Or also the white spots.
The star,
The star on the head, the first time that showed up.
That's right. So this is something like they got all kinds of changes in the coat coloration, but the star on the forehead was just almost too incredible. You know, if you think about horses, there are breeds where you actually see this, and this is not uncommon in domesticated species. But when it popped up in their foxes after only 8 to 10 years, it was astonishing. Ludmila, when she sort of takes off her geneticist hat, would tell me that it was almost that they used to joke around that a star was shining on the experiment after this happened. But whether you had a star on your forehead or not had no effect on whether you were chosen to breed for the next generation.
And then to see whether I'm understanding the biology, Joanne, this thing and the fact that, like one more, by the 8th generation, we had curly tails. And in 1966, some of Ember's pups were tail waggers. And the question then on Belyaev's mind is, how in the world could this be happening in only 6 generations? He thought nice things might happen, that some of these, what we might say now are secondary characteristics, would come along for the ride through some genetic action that was probably less clear at the time. And he settled on hormones as an expression of genetics changing, right? And also the idea that there was what some people would call infantilism, I suppose, that there was delayed development. And this is really getting close to the threshold of exciting ideas too. How in the world could this be happening was the big question that came up by the merest 6th or 8th generations, 1966.
That's right. That's right. And this was for a long time very mysterious. I mean, in the sense that, they did the experiment and the idea was to see if they could watch domestication in real time. But even Belyaev and Ludmila, they were stunned at how quickly it was happening. And Belyaev developed some ideas on why this might be. Basically, this notion that when you do this intense selection. So just to be clear, what they're doing is they're testing hundreds of foxes every year on their tameness, their prosociality towards humans, and then they're choosing the top 10% of the males and the top 10% of the females to breed for the next generation based on their tameness. And so that's very strong selection pressure. Belyaev's thought that strong selection pressure was basically what he referred to as destabilizing the genome. It was basically shaking up a fox genome that had been selected for millions of years to live in a particular environment in the wild, and changing the selective pressures now so that the key thing was no longer avoiding predators and finding food. They got all that at the farm, the foxes. The key thing was how they behaved towards humans. And he thought that the strong selection that they were doing was basically shaking up the genome and releasing a lot of genetic variation that translated into all these other traits that we're talking about, the ears and the tail and the color and all of that.
Right.
But he seemed to realize that had to be something. And I had a note where you wrote, and this is still early in the book, where you said in 1967, my words, that Belyaev realizes the changes they're seeing in the tame foxes are largely due to changes in timing, mostly of delays of various developmental characteristics. And that led him to the idea that he thought hormones must be involved, which is a scientific thesis that they could start testing.
Right. So you're right that many of these traits that they were seeing were juvenilized versions of things that you don't usually see in adults, but you see in juveniles. So that was absolutely key to the way they thought about this. I should say not every one of the traits was that, but a lot of them were. And yes, so from day one, really, Ludmila had been taking measurements on hormone levels as sort of an intermediate between the genetic changes and what they were seeing in the way the animals looked and act. So the idea was that underlying genetic changes were affecting hormone levels, but hormone levels were a lot easier to measure. There was no gene sequencing, and there was a lot easier for them to measure. And they were, within the first generations, their tame domesticated foxes had stress hormone levels that were 50% lower than a typical wild fox. And so on one side, they were less stressed out and scared. right? And that makes sense because because now they're interacting in a much more positive way with humans, and so we're selecting them for how they interact with us. So it's not surprising that when we do that, we end up selecting animals that have low stress hormone levels because they're not as nervous about interacting with us. So right, but on the other side, this took a few more years before they could actually measure it. But on the other side, they also have much higher levels of what we often refer to about today as sort of happiness hormones. Yeah. They have high levels of serotonin, dopamine, and those sort of things. So they're shaking up the whole hormonal cocktail that makes up a fox.
Right. One thing I had mentioned to Jeff, and as I was reading the book, I kept thinking, oh, I'm sure, I know what's coming ahead for science. They're going to be able to, analyze the hormones in more detail, and they're going to be able to sequence the genome and make some matches, right. But it was sort of, it's like, to me, in my own head, I'm creating this wonderful anticipation of what they're going to eventually discover, because I know what scientific discoveries are heading down the line. But when they're doing this 60s, 70s,
they didn't know.
We're just starting to know what hormones do, and what right. they indicate when you see them. So it was great to follow that along.
And I have to say, one of the things about Ludmila and Belayev is that they were always open to bringing in people who could add another either tool or conceptual layer to what they were doing. So they would often bring in people who specialized in hormones. Sometimes they did some really fascinating experiments where they had to transfer developing embryos from one fox to another. So they brought in somebody who had a little bit of experience. They sent them over to the United States to be trained. And as time went in the 80s and 90s and up to today, now they're collaborating with people all over the world. I mean, if it can help them understand domestication, they will work with you. And so it's really remarkable. But yeah, I mean, you sort of look at it today and you think, oh, wouldn't it be great if they now did hormones? Wouldn't it be great if they now could measure facial characteristics in detail and do the genome? Right. Like you say, they didn't know that was going to happen at the time, but they made it happen.
Yeah. And actually, so another thread through this book was Belayev's increasing notoriety throughout the world, and how this helped open science up to in Russia to the rest of the world, like to shake off this Lysenkoism. And then, to really be well known. He starts a collaboration with someone in California, and then someone in England, and then, the National Genetics Conference or International Conference of Genetics, like he gets invited to give a keynote because his work is so significant.
Right. I mean, it's really, when you look at that side of things, the way that it unfolded is really amazing. So like you say, the work is getting out, largely because of him. Because, early on, Ludmila is still very young, and the experiment is associated with Belayev for a while. And so, like you say, he gets invited to give some talks. But then the key thing in terms of both introducing the world to the fox experiment and also finally casting off the shadow of Lysenko is that at these meetings that Belayev is going to, and they're international genetics meetings where thousands of people show up, he has the audacity to go to the directors of this and say, you know what, I want to hold the next one of these in Moscow. And he directs this, and it's a gigantic endeavor that brings literally 3,000 geneticists from around the world. And for him, it's a coming out party to show the world that they have gotten over what the horrors that Lysenko did. And it also had the secondary effect of allowing him to show movies of the domesticated foxes, and people in the audience were just, sitting there with their mouths wide open because, as much as he could, he talked about the experiment, but until he had these people basically there and 3,000 people in the audience, most people in the world didn't know about it. And all of a sudden, there it is. And so it was really an incredibly stunning sequence of events.
Yeah. And it was great to read about that, because now I do look at current Russian science, and it's pretty high level at this point,
Oh, yeah. And in fact, to be fair to them, so Lysenko set genetics and science back 2 to 3 decades single-handedly. Mm-hmm. But before he did it, before he came to power, sort of mostly in the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was really a powerhouse in genetics. And it was only because Lysenko finally lost power that they raised themselves back up to that. And Belayev and many, many other important people played a big role in that. But there was a long period where it was very difficult for them. And so the fact that they did this remarkable experiment in the first place is hard to believe. But the fact that they did it when it was illegal initially is, it's mind-blowing. And
not just illegal, go to jail, illegal, you could die, illegal, right?
Yeah.
And by the time word of this experiment starts getting out at these very large conferences, it's progressed for a long time. And I would think people must have been, I don't know, the project, the experiment is so interesting, but also it's like, where has this been? This has been going on now for nearly 30 years already, and they'd never heard a thing about it.
Right. That was really the case until the late 1970s. So already that big experiment had been going on for quite a long time. I have to say, so I spent a bunch of time over there, and I interviewed dozens of people, and one thing that struck me was even then, so this is the Cold War, and it's hard to get information out. And the thing that really struck me was somehow they, in the Soviet Union, and then later Russia, in the Soviet Union, they were getting information about the science that was going on in the West much more that was going on in the Soviet Union. And it was almost, humbling to hear how they had managed against all odds to keep themselves up to date on the science that was going on around the world, where we were essentially ignorant. And I have to say, unfortunately, to a large extent, many people still are, about the incredible science that goes on in today's Russia, but also in the Soviet Union of that time.
Fortunately, just a brief physics moment. Fortunately, physics has always been going on, and the communication hasn't always been great, but there's been a fair amount, and some very familiar and notable Russian physicists from early in the 20th century. So that hasn't been quite as isolated as this must have been until, and we should note now that Lysenko was finally gotten rid of by 1964.
That's right. So it was only about the first 5 to 6 years of the experiment that true danger was present, and they no longer after that had to hide under the radar.
Yeah.
With respect to Lysenko.
And so they started expanding. They expanded their facility, and for the importance of the story, they built a little house over there. Yeah. So the house.
Yeah, you want to hear the house?
Bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah. I want to hear, because I was going to ask.
Okay.
You got to tell everybody about the little house for Ludmilla and the dog.
The house and pushing.
Fox, but I love it. I love it. No, this is great. I want people to say dog because it sounds so much like a dog. So this was, I think, for me, one of the most heartening tales that I came across from Ludmilla. So what happened was, in the mid-1970s, the experiment was going, they knew it was working. So Ludmilla goes to Belayev, and she goes to him with this audacious idea. She says, I really want to know now how far down the path of domestication these animals have come. And so before this, everything is hyper-controlled, like we talk about, and like you have to have an experiment. But Ludmilla knows, while wolves were being domesticated to dogs, not only were we doing selection in the sense of choosing the wolves that were calmest and most pro-social, but we were kind of living with them. If they weren't directly in our houses, they were around and we were interacting with them. So she says to Belayev, there's this tiny little house on the farm. I want to move in there with a domesticated female, and I want to live with her 24/7. I want to take notes on everything she does, and I want to interact with her the way that we interact with our dogs to see how she behaves. Plus, she's going to choose a female fox that's pregnant, so that when she gives birth in the house, those pups, from the minute they're born, are living with humans. And she has the perfect fox for this. It's a fox by the name of Pushinka, which means tiny ball of fuzz. And from the moment Pushinka is walking, Ludmila says she's the friendliest of all the foxes she had ever encountered. So she knew right then that Pushinka was going to be the one. Then she waited a year because that's when they first get pregnant. Pushinka's mated with a domesticated male. They move into this house, and Ludmila lives with them as if you're living with a dog, and takes notes on them. And they actually end up living in that house for years. And I have to say, you know, the house still stands today because it's a brick house. But if you go inside, it's rubble. But I have to tell you, when we were there, it was -30, and there was 3 feet of snow on the ground. Ludmila insisted on taking me into the inside of the house, walking through the rubble and showing me, this is where Pushinka used to lie down by my side. This is where the pups used to play ball. This is where we go out into the yard. They responded to their names. And so it's anecdotal in the sense that it happened once with Ludmila and these foxes, but it really shed light on just how far down the path of domestication they had come. Now, I don't know how much you want me to get into this story, but you know, some incredible things happened along the way, but the very fact that she lived with Pushinka and the pups like this was taking the next step in the experiment.
One story perhaps that I noted, so I may have wanted you to tell it, was where Ludmila related how Pushinka played dead out in the yard and what resulted from that.
Right. So she was Ludmila had you know, she was living in the house, but she was often going to the institute and stuff. So she came back, and she came back one time, and Pushinka was out there, and Ludmila thought something happened and she was dead. She was just lying out there. And it turns out that she had just been playing dead in order to have a chance to catch a bird that was in the vicinity. So she was doing the sort of thing that she was playing dead the way that you know, dogs might, or other domesticated species might, in order to capture something. And you know, that was sort of, that's why anecdotes like this are really important, because for the most part, they're not studying things like their learning abilities of these foxes, although there has been some pretty cool stuff done on that since then. But you know, when you live with them on a day-to-day basis, you begin to think, my gosh, how, you know, I thought she was dead, but actually she was just playing possum. And you know, you're not going to know that if you, from the controlled part of the experiment, just because it's not part of what they're looking at. But all of a sudden, and Pushinka actually at one point acted as if she was a guard dog protecting Ludmila in another instance that really, really shook Ludmila. I mean, she thought, my gosh, Pushinka is acting as to protect me when she senses danger. And actually, you know, Ludmila will tell you that those kinds of events that happened in the mid-70s, those were the things that going on 20 years by this point. And, you know, it's exhausting work. And by that point, you know, Ludmila she still loved the experiment, but, you know, how long she could go, who knew, right? But when these things started to happen, she knew she was going to do the experiment for the rest of her life. And she is today at 84. Yeah. She's 84 years old. She's still leading the experiment.
You know, actually, I know you have these pictures on your desktop too, but right here, this top picture with the 4 scientists. So we've got Belayev in the middle there, and Aubrey Manning, and Ludmila's way over. I don't know what this looks like on here, and then someone else
to the left.
Anyway, but this whole thing is this bench is the bench Ludmila's sitting on when Pushinka barks at the night guard, and it's
a very, very famous bench there. Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think so. It is. Yeah. And, you know, one other thing I was struck by was when, you know, they put, you know, because originally she had to go far away for the fox farm, and then they had created their own closer by, and that when they hired caretakers, like these caretakers were just smitten with these little foxes and would work and do whatever it took.
No,
didn't mind working overtime. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is something that, you know, it tends to go under the radar. So, eventually when the experiment gets big, they've got 500, 700 foxes. They need a team of people just to take care of them. You got to feed 500 foxes. You got to make sure their cages are clean. You got to make sure that they're healthy. So they brought in a lot of people they refer to as the workers, and mostly these are poor women from local villages. They come in and they have learned both from Ludmila and the whole team that works, but also they could see the way people responded when they would come and visit the experiment. So they knew that this was really important science. They understand basically what's going on. They may not understand the micro details, but they understand basically what the experiment is. And they're astonishing people. They go so far above and beyond what they need to do. I mean, Ludmila and the team, they pay them, and they pay them better than they would get where their village is, but they're not getting a lot of money. They go so far above what their pay grade is. There's a famous experiment that happened where where they had to have, it involved getting data at 2 a.m. in the morning, and it involved going to Akadem Gordak, and these villages where the women lived at 2 a.m. in the morning, getting them in the middle of the freezing winter and bringing them out to the experiment. And Ludmila remembers, and other people remember hearing the workers say that their famous quote was, "If it's for science, we'll do it."
Yeah.
And when I heard that story, I was like, my goodness. I mean, and it's so often that these people go under the radar, but the experiment would not happen without them. And believe me, Ludmila and the whole team of scientists know that, and they do everything they can to help.
And the interaction of all of them, you have a story that I made note of, and this would take us up somewhere in the middle of the 1980s with a little fox named Coco, who made friends with Venya and moved in with Venya and Gala. And Coco, at the time you described as near death, was dying, and nobody really knew why, because she didn't feel like eating, she didn't feel happy, something. But she moved in with them, and things happened.
Yeah, so this is right. So this is the late 80s, and there's this pup Coco, and she's very ill. And so one of the workers, well, actually this was someone who was a little bit higher level than a worker, but she was involved in the experiment, and she and her husband adopt Coco. And Coco, everybody thinks, is on their deathbed, but they bring her back to their house. They live with her. They nurse her up, and then they become very tight, the way that you would with a little dog that you saved their life, right? So what happens is Coco, on a walk one day, escapes. She gets off her leash and by mistake, and she escapes. And there's this great story we tell in the book where, I mean, the entire community rallies to find Coco. Ludmila and everybody are, there are rumors that Coco has been picked up by a bully and brought to his house. They find out that he's been put in this house where the person who found him is going to euthanize Coco for their fur. So they rally, they go to the schools, they say, who is this person? Who's this little kid that may have put it in this house? They find out from the school principal. They have a school assembly where they tell the kids there's this special fox. Finally, they find where Coco is, and they literally make it there when the person who has Coco by force now is about to euthanize her for the fur. They save Coco's life. They bring her back to the house. Venya and Galia, the people who did this, Venya still goes to the grave where Coco was buried, I guess 30 years ago. Yeah. To this day, he goes to the grave. Yeah.
It's really good. So actually, I'd like to shift gears. This is a great book, by the way. Everyone, you should read it. So, and of course, you're writing a lot of books. Why this one? When did you become aware of this story, and what made you think I'm going to go tell this story?
Yeah, so I mean, as somebody who studies evolution and genetics, even as early as grad school, if you take a genetics class, going to come across this experiment. Most of it is in Russian and not in English. So you'll learn about it. You'll get the basics. And so I guess about 8 to 10 years ago, I seriously started thinking about this project, and it struck me. A couple of things struck me. The first one was, because probably 90 to 95% of it is in Russian, my thought was, there's a tremendous amount of science that most people don't know about that needs to be told. But more than that, I knew about Lysenko in general, and I thought that there was also a tremendous political intrigue component to this story. Plus, my thoughts were, you know, there's got to be some amazing human animal love stories in here. So I thought this might be a really good venue to get science out to the public. Because as you and as we all know, one of the things you really want to have is a strong narrative, so that when you're reading it, you're picking up the science by osmosis, but you're really driven by this story about these people, what's going on in their lives. And I thought, boy, I bet you there's something, this would be a great way to do that. So I contacted Ludmila. I asked her if she'd be interested. It took a bit of back and forth, and she said she was. And then within, so we worked a bit together over email, and then I went there and spent some time both in 2012 and 2014. And that's when all of the behind-the-scenes stuff that we were talking about. So Pushinka, Coco and Venya and all these things. These are the stories that come out when you probe people. Tell me, you know, don't just tell, I want everything about the science and tell me everything you can, but I also want you to tell me about things that you as a scientist might say, I know, you know, that's not science. Oftentimes, amazing things come out of those sort of conversations.
There was a sort of,
and once I got Ludmila going, by the way, it took a while, but once I got her going, forget it. I mean, you know, I couldn't get her to stop, which was great. So I have thousands of pages of notes. So, yeah.
So you were made for each other, it sounds like.
Oh, she is. I think of her as a dear friend right now, and I mean, I love her. I mean, and besides being a great scientist, she's an incredible person. I mean, one of the most incredible people I've ever met. I should say just.
Officially a co-author with you of this,
this
book, which is
absolutely Ludmila. Oh, absolutely, Ludmila is co-author, and obviously this book would not have happened without Ludmila. And I will tell you, you know, it's you rarely meet people who have the sort of the combination of traits Ludmila has. She's brilliant. She has a work ethic that's second to none. She is also, when you get to know her, one of the sweetest, kindest people you can imagine. At the same time, she runs a tight ship. And I have this picture, I can't pull it up right now, but I have this picture of me just with my arm around Ludmila. We're just taking a snapshot. She's not 5 feet. She's got to be less than 5 feet. So we're standing, but if I'm in a gang fight and I have to pick someone on my side, give me Ludmila and I'll be happy. I mean, so she's got that unique combination of characteristics that, you know, but you have to be special to be someone who devotes 60 years of your life to an experiment.
Right.
At a time in the book that seemed quite reasonable to me, and this is later on when you're looking at bigger themes and outcomes, and what we were reading about was people's surprise that these things could be happening with mere foxes. And you told stories about bonobos and studies of their societies and their behaviors and surprising discoveries, and particularly the very, very, very shocking discovery that Jane Goodall made when she was at Gombe in the mid-70s, and learning about the behavior of the chimpanzees, particularly the fact that they had never been known to, but yes, they would murder each other. Which was, I remember at the time that was a huge shock to everyone. People couldn't stop talking about it.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, those things and the stories about the foxes, where still, we could talk about critics, but I don't know if there's much need to. People are still surprised and look for ways to poo-poo the idea that a genetics experiment could work this quickly, that you could have anything in 60 years to say about domestication, that these foxes are cute, but are these real scientists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen this, you know, theme come up in other books. It's like, are we still so burdened with Victorian preconceptions about the place of animals and lower creatures in the great chain of being that we just can't accept these things?
I think
how much does that color the experiments that people do? It's like, this is how dogs behave.
I'm sorry, how much does that color?
Earlier on, it seems now, if you look at behavior type of observational science early in the 20th century or so, and then coming up to there, how much of it seems filtered through eyes that say, well, these animals are not smart. They can't have a language. They can't be intelligent.
Right. The extent to which that exists differs from, from what circles you run in. So in general, I think there's still a chunk of the public that can't wrap their mind around the idea that the non-humans are capable of incredibly sophisticated, cognitively complex abilities. They're capable of those sorts of things. We have endless evidence of this. Mm-hmm. Even within science, there's some skepticism, like you're saying, so sort of this preconceived notion that there has to be a simpler explanation than that. And of course, good scientists experimentally examine those alternative ideas, and sometimes they're right. Sometimes there actually is a simpler explanation than was initially thought. Oftentimes not. Oftentimes it's because the animals really are doing things that are sophisticated and cognitively complex, and even the foxes are. Going just briefly touching back to the chimps and bonobos you were talking about, Belyaev actually had a correspondence with Jane Goodall. Unfortunately, that correspondence is lost. It's lost, but it did take place. There's all sorts of interesting things we talk about in the book with respect to chimps and bonobos and domestication, but we don't really have time for that. So I'll leave it to the book.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. And how Belyaev had some interesting ideas of humans domesticating themselves, right?
Yes. And that idea now has come back into vogue and big time. And you're going to be hearing a lot about it over the next couple of years. Belyaev thought about it in the 1950s, way before this.
And we can handily say a person will enjoy reading this book, but cannot read this book without coming to think about those issues, I think.
I hope you're right.
This is good. This is good.
Okay. So I am curious, do you have another project in the works, or?
I do. I've recently started on a new project. It's too early to sort of go into details, but it's actually more along the lines of a prior book I had written on Jefferson and arguments about natural history's role in early America in relation to what's going on around the world. So I'm working on that, and I'm working on other things as well. I give the Fox talk on the book all the time, but I know sooner or later I'm going to desperately miss this project. I mean, it was the single greatest experience of my professional career was the honor of working with all these people to put together this book with Ludmila.
Yeah, and she wanted this story told, so it was wonderful that you were able to help her make that happen.
Absolutely, it was an honor to do it.
Yeah. So, Jeff, is there anything you have finally to ask, or?
Well, there was one more observation that might sum up, but early on in the book, you talked about a General Lukov who visited the farm, and he was seeing what was going on there, and he was petting one of the foxes. And I'm quoting now, you said, there was no denying that the tamest foxes were having a powerful emotional effect on people. And though the study of this effect was not a central component of the design of the experiment, they realized that it was a significant finding.
Right. I mean, so the General Lukov comes there, and so Belyaev had and Ludmila had this habit of bringing VIPs that would come to in the vicinity, and they were VIPs in science, but they were also things like General Lukov, and so it's just I mean, this is a guy who experienced World War II. He experienced the Cold War. This is a hardened warrior guy. And when he comes and starts being transfixed, petting one of the foxes, as a researcher, you're beginning to say, I've got data, books full of data that tell me the experiment's working, but boy, that's what when I see that, I know that these foxes really are going down the path of domestication. And so those stories, those are the things that keep people going when they've been working 35 years on an experiment already. When they see something like that, they know, oh, it's worth it. I'm spending my life in a good way.
This is great. So we're winding down here. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Lee, that maybe we forgot to ask you?
I don't think so. Again, I would say anything people can do to where they might want to try and help this experiment. If you're listening and there are things you might want to do financially or otherwise that might help them out, you could always contact me and I can put you in touch with them. They have funding but they're always looking for as much assistance as possible. So if there are things that people can think of that maybe might help, you are welcome to drop me an email. I'm the only Lee Dugatkin who's written about domesticated foxes, and so you should be easy to find my email address. And I'm at the University of Louisville. But otherwise, I would just say again that this is, I would argue, one of the most important experiments at so many different levels that's taken place over the last 100 years that it's been incredible to have the chance to get involved with it and write the book with Ludmila.
Right, and it is a delightful book, and I find myself here easily recalling events because of the emotions of the people in the book. It's not just about the science, it is about the people, as you said, and yeah, just readily smiling about things in the book. About everything except Lysenko, but but he's
yes,
so important to understand about science in Russia. So
and it is also a very good book about science and how science gets done. We've talked about the human and the fox things, but we see the experiment, and it's got a lot of points to make about how science gets done.
Very solid. All right, so if you guys have a chance, pick up the book, How to Tame a Fox. See, it's not so long, but it's a great story. Very wonderful story.
Thank you very much.
Lee, thank you for joining us today on Read Science, and we'll keep our eye out for future publications you might come out with.
Thank you, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much, I really enjoyed it.
All right, everybody, see you next time.